everybody who is watching this video like in live stream on LinkedIn or maybe later in some platforms like YouTube or in our Spotify channel. This is podcast Happy at Work. My name is Tatiana Koval. And today we'll ask about very interesting topic about complaints and how use them as a power for the company culture development with my new guest, Traci Austin. Hi, Traci.
Hi, how are you this morning?
I'm happy to see you here. And firstly, I want to ask you to make a short introduction about your professional background experience for my audience because it helps them to understand more about you and hope to follow you on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. I own Elevated Talent Consulting, and I've been building human resources departments from the ground up for over 20 years, very much focused on the culture and the people that we are working with, because we believe in the intersection of fulfilling work and for the employee and then hitting those business outcomes for the employer. And when we hit that sweet spot, we can create some really great employee engagement and impact in the work that we're doing.
Tracy, we discussed in our meeting when we prepared for this episode, what we will talk about very interesting issues, complaints of employees, firstly, and how we could use them as an energy for the culture development. Could you please firstly explain a little bit your approach, how we could manage the complaints in the company and making them as a fuel for development?
Yeah. So for our listeners, the first thing I want you to do is think of some of the complaints. And it could be there's no good people to hire. It could be, Joe never shows up on time. It could be so-and-so's never held accountable, but I am. Like whatever those complaints are, I just want you to think of them. And now there's a mindset shift, a belief that I want you to try on. And that is, what if every complaint was just a poorly worded request? So what if every complaint was just a poorly worded request? Now, when we go back to that complaint, we can look at it a little bit differently.
But you need to understand there's great insight about this. But could you please share this first? The idea is how they could make a reframing of this complaint.
Yeah.
Because that's difficult to make for people who usually makes this complaint because maybe they could feel angers or any other feelings what prevents them from making this a positive way. How could we reframe this complaint? What could you
Yeah.
advise?
So, how do we reframe the complaint into a request? So, the first thing we want to do is understand what the complaint is. And most of the time, those complaints are so big, we don't know what the problem is. So, let's look at no one wants to work anymore. Is that a complaint you want to play with, Tatiana, or should we pick a different one?
Let's. I think what firstly we could talk about your candidates is not very good, is not suitable. What
Okay.
could
So, I
you
have
do
no
with this
suitable
complaint, for
candidates
example?
for this job.
Yes, for this appropriate job which we have another company in my department, for example.
Yeah. So, the complaint is I have no suitable candidates for this position. So, the first thing we're going to do within that complaint is look at what the facts are. And this is where the fun comes into play, right? Because now we get to really look at and take it out of the story. There's no suitable candidates for this job, and actually look at, all right, what are we actually looking for? So now I'm going to say, okay, what are the facts? All right, we've received 72 candidates. Fact. We are looking for someone that has experience with customer service. We're looking for somebody that has professional writing ability to a high level English proficiency. We're looking for someone that can write bullet points and hold accountability in what they're doing. We're looking, and you can kind of see now all of a sudden I have very specific checkpoints for what we're looking for that I can actually measure against. So, fact, 72 applicants. Fact, I know exactly what I'm looking for because I have the checklist for it, and I'm hoping it's prioritized, right? And then from there, it is okay. What is the, 72 applicants that we have as aligned to what our checklist of priorities are? Now, within that, are we ever going to find anyone that's 100% there? Probably not. But what we do need to do is get really clear on what those specifics are. Now we can look at those 72 candidates and say, okay, 50 of them are out 100%. Like they don't meet any of it. Now we've got 10 that meet 60%. We've got 12. Yes, 50 plus 10 plus 12 equals 72. We've got 12 that meet, 80%. Of those 12, now we can start to dig in. So if I look at that and say, I have 12 candidates that meet the minimum requirements for this job, do we hear how different that is? Then I have no viable candidates. From there, now we can look at and say, okay, what do we want to do with this? Maybe those 12 really don't meet it. So we need to go back and repost the job now that we have the very, very specifics of what we want. So when we go through this process of every complaint is just a poorly worded request, what we got to by walking through the facts is what our actual requests are, which means we may now need to repost this job with the request of what we're looking for. We may need to go back on LinkedIn and start doing some keyword searches for candidates and actually tap them on the shoulder. So now we can make those requests as to what we need. We may need to make a request and work with a recruitment firm and very specifically, but the complaint, no viable candidates, gets us into, okay, here's where we're at. If we have 50 that don't match, what's happening that even attracted those 50 versus we want to detract them so they don't even apply. And then we can start to walk through what's needed because the impact of that is significant. And then, of course, we have our requested action. So my requested action, every complaint is a poorly worded request. We started with, we have no viable candidates. Now, Tatiana, my request may be, here's the job description and the minimum requirements for this role. My request is that we repost it in this way. My request is we ask all of our current team members if they know anyone that potentially fits this. My request is we put a post out on LinkedIn with this. And if those 4 things don't work, can we contact a recruiter that we know does a really good job in this? Now we're getting closer to the solutioning versus just complaining.
It's a great example. It's a great example how to create the new culture of communication with leaders and for leaders for better understanding from complaints, for how to use some questions and how to use analysis for better understanding the needs. Traci, could we also discuss the topics about how we could create the new culture based on the complaints of employees? Because I also agree with you that some complaints could have a great potential for developing. For example, very common complaints. I feel myself underpaid. I'm unpaid. So what could we hear from these complaints and how we could work the thing for improving another culture, for change another culture, for communication maybe with leaders? What are your ideas about this?
Yeah. So I believe that I'm underpaid, right? And we definitely hear this one a lot. And so for our employers and HR folks listening in, what I really want you to think through is your processes transparent? Because if your processes aren't transparent, guess what? If we don't explain and name what things are, people make things up. And when we make things up, there are complaints, but they also impact engagement. They drive gossip at work. They drive all those things. So my assumption here is that for our listeners, you have a very specific process for how pay is created. You've done the pay bands. Those pay bands are tied into the core competencies of the role. They're set up by levels from director level, executive level, VP, director to your line level staff. If not, that is something that I would highly recommend you look into creating. Now, once you have those things, share those. In the United States, the majority of states now have shifted into a pay transparency, meaning we need to post what those ranges are. And the more transparent we are with what it takes to move from one pay range to the next pay range, what we've done is we've created a pathway for our employees to say, if you want to increase your pay, that's great. There is a value exchange for that. We're no longer in a parent-child relationship that says, hey, I just want more money because I want it. We are now in a value exchange, and we've laid out what that value exchange is by having our pay structures there and having those transparent. And what it does is it takes the noise. I'm not going to say it takes it away, but it minimizes it.
Okay. Tracy, I have one provocative question for you. Times to times, the employees could feel themselves maybe distracted from some culture issues, but they could not come and say, I don't like my boss, or my boss is a person who make a lot of stress in my work. So in this situation, they could start to talk about any other topics. It's more comfortable for discussing in the company, that you could discuss more openly. How could you recommend to work this complaints and understanding the real problem in the organization? Because for me, it's also the way for improving your culture, for things, the tough situation, for changing them. Maybe could you share some your professional background, your professional experience, and maybe you could share some complaints that typically people use in this situation, which we don't like to say the truth, real truth, and how to initiate a more open dialogue in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. This is such a great question. And I want to take 2 steps back before I answer it. And, one of the things that is so important is if as leaders, we are asking for the information, we have to do something about it. So are there organizations that may ask for the information and not do anything about it? For sure. What that does is that erodes trust in the organization. And if there's not trust between the leadership and the employees because complaints have been shared and nothing's been done about it, or something's been done about it, but it hasn't been communicated back, that's almost as bad as not doing anything about it. Like, I hope that puts some light bulbs on for folks, right? So, Tatiana, you ask a hard question in that so much of it depends upon what the culture is. And there's not a broad brush answer to it. If the leadership team is putting a blind eye to the complaints, then that employee needs to look at and say, are my personal values in alignment with the company values? And that's then a question you need to weigh. Okay. So I'm going to answer this question with the assumption that, the culture is there, that trust has been built between the executive leadership team and the team. We have a manager that, for whatever reason, there's not trust between the manager and that employee. And guess what? This happens a lot. I'm not saying it's right, but it happens a ton because I think it's over 80% of new leaders in organizations are not trained in leadership. Right? So our managers have never received training on how to actually lead. They were great in their role and promoted. So with that being said, we've got a culture where executive leadership team says, yes, we want to know these things. Here's what we're doing. We have a manager that's not doing it. So what do we do? And what we do is if your organization does pulse surveys or climate surveys, put those in there, because that is one of the best ways we have found to get the feedback back that is anonymous yet tied to every manager, so that we can actually go back and do the coaching with the managers. And again, every complaint is a poorly worded request. So the request for this manager may be, I really, for me, I need someone that gives me, the appreciation for what I'm doing, but also spends the quality time with me as an employee to help me understand what is needed. My manager's not doing that. Okay, so my request is that I have clear goals, that I have the support from my manager to do it, and that I get the feedback when I'm doing something correctly, right? And so with this, the key here is that feedback cycle is given, and we're getting, that transparent communication back. The goal is always to go to our manager first. If we're not getting a response to that, then we definitely want to go to that next level.
I have one more question. It's also from talk about the connection with managers, about leadership. I know what the last, I think, 5 years, a lot of companies paid a lot of attention to the topic of feedback, how to give feedback. And also for me, it's the connections with complaints. So maybe I use this idea and ask you, what could you recommend for the companies who want to make a training, how to make complaints the appropriate way, which, for example, help us to improve our culture, which help us to improve our organization? What could you recommend? How could you recommend to implement the policy for openness for the complaints, how to complain the right way, and how the company could work with it? If, for example, one of the company asks you, please, Traci, could you make for us a training for making the culture of right and positive complaints?
Absolutely. We have a training for that. It's called the culture of gratitude. And then I also have something called our Tough Talk blueprint of how to actually go through and have these conversations and give feedback. So I love to walk through kind of 6 steps to a productive, I'm going to call it a tough talk, because no one likes having these conversations. And it's a way of giving really strong feedback while bringing in collaboration. So the first is to prep with intention, just as we talked about with our complaint, which is, are we really, does our complaint actually get us to a place we can solve the problem? Most of the time it doesn't. So we have to dig into the facts. So we're going to prep with intention for this feedback conversation, meaning we know the goal of the conversation. So the goal of the conversation, if I'm talking with an employee about, let's say I'm talking with a manager that we were just discussing that we're receiving complaints from their employee on. So my goal with this manager is that I can bring up their awareness to the impact of their interpersonal relationships with their team. That's my goal. So I'm going to prep with intention. I'm going to set the tone with that employee. So when I walk into the meeting with that manager, I'm going to lead with respect, honesty, and openness. And I may say, I'm going to call this manager Sarah. Hey, Sarah, thank you so much for meeting with me today. My intention of this conversation is to bring forward some feedback that may be difficult to hear, yet I am committed to your ability to lead in this role, and know that, this doesn't happen without training and without coaching and without honest feedback. Therefore, this conversation is meant to do that in order to get some impacts and changes within this collaboratively. Does that work for you? So that's step 2. Step 3 is to stick to the facts. We want to ground the conversation in specific, observable facts. We also need to acknowledge the human impact. And so that may look something like, hey, Sarah, I understand because I gave you the goals that you're to hit this, and this metric. You know what? You've hit those metrics well. However, the flip side of that is, we're receiving this, and this complaint from folks. We actually saw turnover in your team over the last 6 months. And I want to address this so that we can do an and both of hitting the measurable results and elevating the people on our team. Does that feel like something that we can do? And then I just stop talking and I listen. So step 4 is notice what's not being said. Create the space to let them talk and listening deeply into that. And then, you know what? I don't have all the best solutions. You might, right? So we're going to start collaborating on the solutions that work for that person that still hit the goal and the intention of the conversation. Then we're going to clarify the next step and agree on a clear action. And we're going to follow it up with an email so it's in writing. That is our 6 steps for productive, tough talk on how to give feedback that gets results.
Traci, thanks a lot for so great explanation what steps we need to do for you, giving the real working feedback. I also could focus of one of the steps you mentioned. It's steps about listening. Because our ability, the skill of listening, also I think in some situations need to be improved. Because over time, so they need another person, especially when they talk about tough dialogue, we try to think what we could say to the answer, maybe, and so on. So, could we discuss a little bit how could we train our employees, our leaders, for better and more effective listening? Could you share your ideas, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I love this question because we do this so often in our leadership development program. Every cohort we do this in. And that listening, the first thing that I like to kind of share is we listen from where we're sitting. Here's what that means. Whatever's in my head, meaning, whatever situation I currently have going and what my experiences are is going to create how I interpret and how I listen. And so if we can just acknowledge that to begin with, that we're all going to hear things differently, that's a great place to start. So in my training courses, a lot of times what I do, actually all the time, what I do is I have different exercises where we will put different things up and then ask folks what they saw. And guess what? It's almost always very, very different. We were all given the same exact instructions. We were all looking at the same exact examples, but we had different results. Once we can see that we're listening based on what is inherent to us, now we can introduce something that's really fun in listening, and it's called curiosity. Right? So that curiosity for, I wonder what, that other person's intention is. Once we can start to get curious about what's there, now we're listening to understand versus listening to respond. That distinction of listening to understand means I actually have to listen all the way through the conversation before I can respond. And here's what, the data has shown us. It takes us 2 seconds actually to really think through and respond. So if someone's interrupting, they're listening to respond versus listening to understand.
Absolutely agree. Absolutely. Especially it's very important for the high context culture. Because if we talk with low context culture, it's maybe easier for us to understand that we talk about cross-cultural issues, especially, for example, we work with people from different countries, from different culture. You need to listen for understanding better, for better understanding, for preparing our response. And Traci, my next question will be also a little bit provocative for you, but we discussed the complaints as energy for changing culture, for improving culture. But in some situation, we could meet with a person it's a really toxic person because he or she could complain every time. How people, what is the border between two situations? When we see what this is complaints are the fuel for development, or when the complaints become a fuel for destruction, our culture. What could you recommend?
Yeah. I love your questions, and I don't think they're provocative. What I believe they are is we're asking the questions that folks don't always ask. So thank you for them. And the first thing here, we talked about transparency several times in this conversation. Another piece that I think is so incredibly important is definition. So we talked about this in the example with the job description. What is the definition for what we're looking for? Here, the definition of our culture. Have we defined what culture means? Is it teamwork? Is it collaboration? Is it integrity? Like, what are the most important core values in your culture? And what does that actually look like in behaviors that are lived out day to day? If we have not yet defined culture and the behaviors that are or are not okay, I would challenge you to really start to think about that. And here's the deal. You don't have to go back and say, oh, I can't do anything with this employee who's potentially toxic because I haven't defined this yet. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is we can do an and both. And it takes time to create this if you've not started this from scratch, right? And so, typically when I come into organizations, we're doing all these things at once. And you know what? We're looking at what's the situation that's here right now in front of us. And I had a situation this morning. And so we're walking through this item and saying, here's the culture, here's the conversations we've had. This individual still is not aligning with the culture, and we've explained it, we've defined it with the team. Now we're at a point where this individual is no longer a fit to the culture. So we're at a point in our accountability that we essentially are at a limit. If this does not happen, then this will happen. And so there is an and both here as to defining the culture, holding accountability to it, because complaints then are probably coming in from other sources around the impact this individual's having on the culture. And the question I love to ask is the value this person is bringing greater than the discourse in negative impact that they're having? And then that allows us to go through and have that tough talk that we just walked through.
Raisa, thanks a lot. The time is coming so quickly, especially when we have so fruitful conversation. But in the end, before we end our conversation, please, could I ask you last questions? It's also my traditional questions to all my guests. 3 main tips which you could give to all the companies, to all the leaders who want to use complaints as a source for improvement. What 3 main tips could you give them?
Yeah. Tip number 1 is the mindset. Do you believe every complaint is just a poorly worded request? Because what it'll do is it'll create curiosity. So 1, check your mindset. 2, have you built trust with your team that they believe that they can bring things to you? If not, go back to number 1. Right? And then that third one is ask curious questions. Ask the questions to get to the facts, to get to, the definition around the outcome that you're both looking for.
Raisa, thanks a lot for our ideas that you shared today in this episode. I could recommend to all my audience follow you on LinkedIn. There you share more and more interesting ideas and more interesting topics for discussion and for thinking. Thanks a lot for your participation in our podcast, Happy at Work. This is podcast Happy at Work. Stay connected.